So here we're looking at a similar situation, but we're looking at two boats crossing tacks or crossing jives. If they were, it's more or less the same thing. And you know, in addition to the current that we'll have to deal with at the start, these are the other things that we all know make a big difference in racing. And I think we all know that we can gain and lose a lot in wind shifts. The math can be pretty staggering. Fortunately, we all don't live in a vacuum, and even though we don't all manage to capitalize on every wind shift, we do pretty well as a whole on getting the averages. So we might miss the first one, and we might miss one or two after, but in general, we're pretty good about hanging right in there, which is why we don't see these giant deltas that could happen as you see here. And it's kind of like, you know, looking at your portfolio in the morning and realizing you've lost 90% of your money, such as it was in 2008, and then just selling it all. So that would be tacking on a giant lift, I guess. That would be. But with that in mind, you can also play that back into what we were just talking about, the VMC angle, where you've got one boat that's reaching a little bit faster than the other one, and the mark is stationary. So the boat that's going on a VMG angle is going, and VMG is the best course you can do in order to get yourself upwind or downwind. The boat that's going on the VMG angle is doing the best they can to get to the mark. The other one's going as fast as they can go towards the mark, but the mark is also in the same place. So as we all head this way, the bearing of the mark is going to change. So if you're sailing VMC, you're going to run out of time where you're actually going to sail beyond the mark. So you have to be really, really careful. So, and that's why it's really important, conversely, it's really important that if you know that there's a big wind shift happening, say the wind is from the south and we expect it to go to the southwest, we might keep sailing hard, fast, into the southwest wind, and when it shifts, we might go back into what we call a VMG mode, because we've gained all we needed to gain, and now we're in a whole new situation. And again, that plays almost in the same thing we were talking about, the entrance to halibut leg, where, you know, just make sure that if you do want to mode your boat differently, and when I say mode, okay, we're not just sheeted in hard going upwind, we want to just crack off a little bit, go a little faster. Make sure you've got everything set up to do that, and whether it be just things on a slightly more outboard lead with the Genoa, or maybe the crew sits one or two persons further aft than normal, and you know, various boats have different ways of moding themselves. So keep that in mind. And same thing downwind, you know, maybe you're not just trying to ease the sheet and sail as low as you can. Maybe you're sailing a little bit hotter than you were, and maybe half a knot faster towards a certain direction. And as the wind comes around behind you, maybe you're going back to your regular VMG mode. And then as it shifts more behind you, maybe you're jibing and you're taking advantage of all that reaching that you did in the beginning. Questions? Okay, so enough of that technical stuff. Want to have a beer?
Beer break.
We should talk a little bit more about the course itself and some of the, you know, things that have worked very well in the past. And we're fortunate enough to have Doug here with us again, who's helped us out a lot in the past, as you know, with this, and has won many times. And you know, I think just for simplicity and time, we should talk about some of the potential minefields out there. And you know, for me, from the start, you know, the first thing that I would make sure that I didn't want to miss out on was obviously getting in that river that we looked at earlier. And so from there to Point Atkinson, pretty straightforward. Just, you know, avoid having the opportunity of taking advantage of that. And then from Point Atkinson towards Roger Curtis and in between and Cowan Point and all that, it gets very, very interesting, and even more so when you're coming back towards the finish, which we'll go into in a minute. But what generally happens is if it's blowing from the southeast, the wind generally bends a little bit more south as it goes in Howe Sound, as you can imagine, due to the geography. So there's a bit of a wind shift there. So if we're running out of the bay, we might find a slightly favorable angle if we're sort of in a line between Point Atkinson here and Cowan Point. And if we went inside that line, sort of towards where we are here, we'd probably find that that wind would lighten off somewhat. So it might be a little bit dangerous. But as we get down Bowen Island, then hopefully we've still got a little bit of the ebb helping us out. And as we get what I'd call around the middle of Bowen Island, the part that protrudes southward the most, I think you have to be a little bit careful about being in there anymore. At that point, you're really just trying to make sure that you're on course to where you're trying to get to. And very rarely, at least for another 5 or 6 miles, do you see people actually jiving back in towards, you know, Gibson's or halfway down between Gibson's and, I don't know, what would it be? Mary Island, I guess.
Yeah.
Very rarely do you see people jiving in there, maybe only to catch the last bit of
a puff.
Yeah, a puff or something like that. So from there it's pretty straightforward. The one caution about Bowen Island, and most of you that have sailed already have seen it, is if the wind is a little more south than east, it lifts over Bowen Island. So, you know, keep your distance from the shore. And there's also, the more south that it is, the more waves that sort of bounce back off the Bowen shore, and you can get trapped in there in a vacuum. And
they're still out there from 1978.
Yeah, I've been trapped in there. Yeah.
Okay.
Only to put the engine on and go home. Yeah, that's another story for another night. So that's the next pitfall. And then if you're going over to Entrance Island in the short course, pretty direct route. And you may not even be dealing too much unless the wind goes light with this Bowen Island scenario. You might be able to sort of get out from Point Atkinson and start making your way over towards Entrance, because by the time you get towards Entrance, the current would have already switched the other way to a more favorable way, so you should be just fine. If you're on your way to Bolinas, you've still got a chance to maybe do a couple of jives, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's blowing from the southeast that you're pretty close to being on ley line by the time you're at least at Collingwood Channel. And if you're going to Sisters, you've got sort of more room to play with. You can almost, you know, if you really wanted to stick to the right, you could sort of head towards Malaspina Strait, which is the top end of Texada, and over towards Secret Cove there, and before you actually have to make one last jive and get around the top of Sangster Island. Sisters Island. Doug, do you have any?
It's a silly place.
It's a silly place.
Silly windy place, yeah.
Silly windy place.
Yeah,
That's, in general, you know, I think there's a really good comment here from Ty, is, you know, how I would look at the start of a Straits race. If it's blowing 10 knots at the tugboat at the start line, it's probably a good chance it's going to be blowing 15 or more by the time you get to Point Atkinson. And there's a good chance that it could be blowing close to 20 by the time you get out in the Straits. So, you know, just be aware that it does pick up. And then if you had to rank the windiest places in our strait, you know, I'd say Bolinas Island and Sisters Island surely are the, you know, probably the gold and silver medal winners in that regard. And Entrance Island probably a little bit below that. So if you're expecting a windy forecast, you can be pretty sure that as you go down the track, it's probably just going to get windier. And as the strait gets narrowed, especially with Texada Island there, you know, the venturi starts to increase and that sort of thing, and then it can get pretty breezy. If it's blowing from the northwest, a little bit different. Sisters Island generally doesn't get quite as much wind as Bolinas Island does, and Entrance Island's kind of right there next to Bolinas Island. They both can get the most amount of wind, and they both definitely get more wind than we see what I call on the mainland side here. So, you know, I think that's a general expectation. You know, if you go down beyond Point Grey towards Sandheads and that sort of thing, they get a lot of wind, but that's not really going to affect us in this race. What else? Pitfalls. Let's talk about Bolinas Island.
You know, Bolinas, there can be some holes right there on the back end of Bolinas if it's in a southeast. Where again, there's probably still some boats there from 1978. So you have to pay attention because it's a fairly high
yeah, so Bolinas Island's a pretty tall. It's two big islands and a bunch of smaller ones. And what usually you can see there is you can use it to your advantage a little bit. If you look at a chart closely, and I'm happy to put one up on the screen here, there are a few opportunities you can take in order to do a few tacks, and we're talking about if it's blowing from the southeast, in order to get out of either the current or the waves or both. And we're really only talking about a minute or two, you know, normally on starboard tack, and then quickly back onto port. But it saves you a bit of aggravation of dealing if it's choppy, of dealing with the chop, and delays that until you get around the islands.
There's a big Jesus rock out there too.
Yeah.
Still some
big
Andy
Jesus
Fowler.
rock out there.
Andy Fowler
The
big on
Wink
that.
Vogel Memorial Trophy. The charts are pretty good around all of these islands, including Entrance. And so if you're using Navionics on your iPad or on your stuff, that stuff is good. It's as good as anything. And you know, just trust it. It should be just fine. When you're coming around Entrance, there's a few rocks on the northwest side which you have to be a little bit aware of, and so try not to cut it too fine on that side.
Yeah, that entrance always involves two other marks. It's actually entrance plus two other marks.
Plus the two little yellow ones, right?
Yeah.
The government.
Yeah, and they're not lit.
Yeah, unlit red cans, yeah.
Yeah. So if you hear a bomb, you hit.
It might be too close.
Yeah.
Can I see it? Can I see? Oh, there it is.
So that would be entrance there. Not much to really be too concerned about, other than on the northwest corner. Again, with Bolinas, though, I would suggest, depending on which way the current is going, you know, try and think about these islands, the sisters as well, as a bit of a cone. So if the current is really, in this case, if it's flooding, you know, you can use it as a bit of a cone, which is why, even though the wind might be a little bit fluky, you might want to head for that flatter water and get out of the adverse current, you know, even if it's for a minute or two. And then at least you're to weather of your competitors that haven't chosen to do that. And I think it's just a safe maneuver.
Yeah,
It's
well,
one of the only places you can get out of the chop and for at least a couple miles until you get closer to the windshield seas, which is not a great option if it's...
well, there's a bunch of shifts that you can play with,
Yeah.
as opposed to being right out under the strait.
Correct.
And it comes from the island most of the time. So you can work with that. Whereas out in the middle of the straits, you're just going where you're going.
It's just straight southeasterly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what Doug was just saying there is after Bolinas, there can be some shifts on the Vancouver Island side, and even more so when they have a qualic of wind, which is after a front is passed and the gradient is from the southwest. It blows through those valleys, and in the South Island it's Cowichan Valley and
Even
Strait,
Nanaimo.
and through Nanaimo, yeah, and definitely through sort of the Comox down through you know, Qualicum Beach and that sort of thing. So, and then in between those areas, it goes back to a southeasterly, because that southwest wind can't get up and over the mountains. So, so what you may have happen is you go around Bolinas Island, and you might immediately, if you were on port tack, get into a Qualicum wind, which will tack on, and now we'll be paralleling the Vancouver Island shore, heading back up to entrance, which is great. What may happen to our competitors is if they tacked earlier than we did, they might be in the southeasterly the whole way up there. And is what usually happens is any time, anywhere in the world for that matter, where two winds are fighting each other, there's usually a period or a transition zone where there could be absolutely nothing or a very fluky wind. And it's trying to decide about when you want to get out of that Qualicum, just having the confidence and knowing that it's probably not going to last all the way up to Entrance Island. You might get lucky, but probably not. And you're probably going to be finishing that leg back on the southeasterly. So that's how you would look at that scenario if it happened. So it's all good when it's there, it's just don't expect more. In the northwesterly, what you'll find is coming around Bolinas it's pretty straightforward, but be careful about getting within about a mile of the shore, especially in around the Winchelsea area. As you get down towards Nanaimo, it's not so bad because the shore kind of protrudes out a little bit, but be very, very careful about getting too close to the shore. You're just going to find less and less pressure. Where else have we covered? So now we're on our way back, I guess. So we can't go around those same islands twice in a night in this race.
Not on purpose.
So let's deal with how we're going to approach the finish. So if we're approaching in a southeasterly, there's a good chance that our approach, even from below Nanaimo, is going to be probably, well northwest of here. And so, which means we're going to have to tack up towards Gibson's and across the Bowen shore, and then through across the sound here, and then up to Point Atkinson. For those of you that have never done the race before, it's not over till the finish line. The mistakes that you can make is again, in a southeasterly, taking advantage of that lift, which we'd call on starboard tack lift, as we came over from Bowen towards the Point Atkinson here. And then how we finish the race is going to be a little bit dicey, because what you're going to find is as you get closer to Point Atkinson, the wind is going to start to lift over the hill there. So even though we're getting lifted, we're almost laying the finish line. This is going to be great. Look at those guys offshore, they're looking horrible. We still got to make that final tack onto port and try and muscle our way around